Hey, this is Mrs. Reichelt, and our next video that we're going to cover goes over the cardiovascular system. So a couple of major items here that we have to go over is that it is a closed system. That means that your blood is not able to just freely move wherever it wants to in the body. It's going to be surrounded by blood vessels, and whether they're veins or arteries, they don't really have free reign around your body. Also, the function of the cardiovascular system is to deliver oxygen and other nutrients, and also to remove carbon dioxide and other waste products from the body. So your heart is located in your thorax. We call it mediastinum. Medial meaning it's the middle, and whoops, here's a bigger picture. I'll go back to that in a minute here. But mid-sternal or mediastinum, meaning that it's halfway through your sternum. So that dotted line is supposed to be your sternum. Media meaning that's in the center of that. You also have this pointed apex that points towards your left hip. The base is going to point towards the right shoulder, and your heart is about the size of your fist. If we go into this really descriptive picture, we'll see a couple of other things here. So a little orientation. This is going to be your right atrium. This will be your right ventricle. Your left atrium is kind of hidden there in the back, and your left ventricle is right there. You also see the superior vena cava. Also, this is the aorta. This is the pulmonary trunk, and it ends up going into the pulmonary veins, but that's a little detail there, and we'll get a little bit more specific as we continue. So here's another diagram that you might want to reference as you're doing some of your questions, some of your lab questions. I'm going to go ahead and brush by this right now, but we'll reference it in a little while. So the layers of the heart, your heart is made up of a bunch of layers. So let's see, I'm just going to draw my heart here. So the pericardium is a double-walled sac. It's made up of a couple of specific layers here. So the pericardium is made up of a fibrous pericardium, which is loose and superficial. Then you have the serous membrane, which is deep to the fibrous pericardium. It's made up of a visceral pericardium and a parietal pericardium. So if you remember from first try, I told you that the layers are going to be in alphabetical order from the outside in when you get to the serous membranes. So P comes first, so the parietal layer is on the outside. Visceral comes next, so that's going to be the innermost layer. Then you also have the serous fluid, which is the space between the layers of the pericardium. Here's a detailed picture of each of the layers. So you have the fibrous pericardium, which is the outermost part. Then you have the pericardial cavity, which in here you have that serous fluid. The epicardium we were talking about is right in here. That epicardium does make up the visceral and parietal layers. Then you have the myocardium, which we haven't talked about yet. Myo means muscle, so this is the actual muscle part of the heart. And then the endocardium, this is the endo part. This is the actual heart chamber. So that's where your blood is going to be. So again, the three layers, you have the epicardium, which is the outer layer, the myocardium, which is the muscle layer, and then the endocardium, which is the inner layer. All right, so now we're kind of getting into the different chambers. So you have 4 chambers of your heart, which we kind of already talked about a little bit. The atria are known as the receiving chambers, meaning that they're receiving blood. They're not the actual pumps. The ventricles are the pumps of the heart, or the discharging chambers. Sometimes the atria are named a little bit tricky. Sometimes people call them anterooms, which is basically a waiting room. So this is your right atrium, your right ventricle, your left atrium, and your left ventricle. Then we have something called an interventricular septum. So an interventricular septum is going to separate the two ventricles. That's probably more important than the interatrial septum. So the interventricular septum is basically this line right here. So it's just sort of how we get familiarized and how we get oriented if we were to do a heart dissection. Then we have a couple of valves. So the valves in the heart are really important because they help to prevent backflow. Backflow means that you don't want to have blood that's kind of going the wrong direction. That wouldn't be very efficient. So there are 4 major valves. You have the AV valves. There are 2 AV valves, and there are 2 semilunar valves. So the AV valves are called the atrioventricular valves. They're named according to they're located in between the atria and the ventricles. So the first one is the bicuspid valve. This is on this side of the heart. The bicuspid is characterized by having 2 of those flaps. And sometimes, instead of calling it a bicuspid, we call it a mitral valve. The tricuspid valve is here on this side. It has 3 flaps. That's where it gets its name. Then you have the semilunar valves. The pulmonary semilunar valve is right here because it's heading into the pulmonary trunk. The aortic semilunar valve is actually a little bit hidden, but it's right in here. And basically, this the aortic semilunar valve ends up going into the aorta. So a little bit more detail here. The AV valves are anchored in place by the chordae tendineae. Those are called your heartstrings. So if you hear people saying things like, oh, you're pulling at my heartstrings, they're really talking about the chordae tendineae. So the AV valves are going to be open during heart relaxation and closed during contraction. The semilunar valves are going to act in the opposite direction. So they'll be closed during relaxation, but open during ventricular contraction. So it is important to know that these are going to work opposite of each other. So with that, this covers the first half of the heart anatomy. So you'll tune in for the next one. I hope you found that helpful.